And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right?
What happens when one of Christianity's biggest claims gets challenged head-on? Wes Huff recently joined Piers Morgan to discuss the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and Piers came with tough questions. This wasn't just a conversation about religion. It became a debate about evidence, faith, and one question that changes everything. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Before we dive into the full story, please do well to like this video and click that subscribe button so we can grow this community together and have more conversations about Christianity. Let's get into it.
If you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
See, that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected really goes to the absolute essence and heart of Christianity. Because obviously, if he was, then that is a miracle. And then everyone that believes in Christianity and what it all stands for and Jesus and everything would feel validated by the fact, well, how else do you explain it? So it's at the crux of it. From the text of the New Testament, then, is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed, for example?
Oh, definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate.
Where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels. So we have a character who lived, who died, and then a character who is said by an early Jesus community to have been resurrected. And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant. They're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. What we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him. And this happened over the course of, as Luke in his combination, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, says over the course of 40 days. This wasn't a short event. And so there were as many as, Paul says, up to 500 witnesses who took part in this event.
Now, this is where the conversation gets interesting. One common objection is you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. Wes responds by arguing that the discussion isn't based only on the New Testament. He points to historical sources outside the Bible that scholars often consider when discussing the life of Jesus and the rise of early Christianity. His point is simple. The real debate isn't just whether Jesus existed, it's what we do with the claims made about him. But Piers isn't backing down. He pushes back with the question skeptics have been asking for years. Let's see how Wes handles it.
Play devil's advocate. The argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history, in one sense, is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. When we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail. And then we try, to the best of our ability, explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of this event is really early on after Jesus's death, we have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus's disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. One of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
This is probably one of the strongest points raised in the conversation. The argument here isn't necessarily that suffering or dying proves something is true. It's that people usually don't willingly suffer for something they know they personally invented. If you're enjoying these conversations so far and you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please go ahead and click that subscribe button so we can keep building this community together. The disciples, according to Christian tradition and early Christian accounts, didn't gain power, wealth, or comfort from proclaiming Jesus. They faced opposition and hardship while continuing to preach what they believed they had witnessed. And that raises a difficult question. If they knew it was false, why keep going? For many Christians, that doesn't prove the resurrection by itself, but they see it as part of why the claim deserves serious attention. But Piers isn't done pushing back. Let's see how Wes responds to the challenge.
The counter-argument is that Paul the Apostle wasn't there for the resurrection himself, and there's no other reference really, other than I think the 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There's only one other reference to the fact that 500 people witnessed this. Does any of that, in your eyes, put more doubt on it?
I don't think so, because I think when we look at something that we can try to historiographically explain, we look at the various explanations and then we account for the data. So you're correct in the sense that 1 Corinthians 15 is the only place that's mentioned where we talk about these 500 witnesses who saw Jesus all at once. However, when you corroborate those with the accounts that we find particularly in Matthew, Luke, and John, I think it does explain especially when you have the instance at the ascension in Matthew and Luke, that those 500 people could have been the individuals on the mount when Jesus ascended. It's not overt in the text, but I think even the fact that we have one instance of this being spoken about, and then we can look at the individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then others in the New Testament documents that talk about the resurrection of Jesus, that, even James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as our glorious Lord, a title that is attributed only to the God of Israel, Yahweh. So I think we have to explain these particular instances where we don't just have people who are friendly to this happening, but we have individuals who are actually hostile. In James, the brother of Jesus, who the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family was actually very hesitant in how public Jesus' ministry was. Then we have likewise Paul, who started his life as a persecutor, and that has a radical 180 in terms of him then going on and writing the majority of Holy Scripture within the New Testament.
I've seen Ricky Gervais on various talk shows. He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one? And what about the others then? Do they not exist? Are they not real gods? In other words, his position is, look, you can't all be right unless there are 3,000 different versions of a supernatural spiritual being overseeing us all. What do you say to him?
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality. So say we're using a courtroom analogy. If someone was convicted of a crime here in the city of Toronto, where I live, and he stood before a judge and he said, really, you think I committed this crime? Do you know how many people are in the city? We have 3 million people in this city. And you think I'm the one who did the crime? Really? Out of all the, how many people are in Toronto? How many people are in Ontario? How many people are in Canada? How many people are in North America? You really think that given the amount of people that are on this earth, I'm the one who committed the crime? We wouldn't then look at the judge and say, well, that's a good argument. Have you really thought about how many other people are around who, just because this particular individual you think committed the crime? Really? Well, no, we don't just arbitrarily, pick someone, or in the case of Christianity, pick a God. We believe that the God of the Bible is the true God based on the evidence of not just what we find in the Bible, but, the fine-tuning of the universe, of the morality in the objective reality of this world, and the fact that we are, Piers, people who operate with morals, with meaning and intention, and have intrinsic worth. But we look at these things and we don't arbitrarily pick Yahweh, the God of the Bible, over Zeus and Thor and Allah and Buddha. We do it, I would argue, based on the concrete, publicly available evidence that points to the truth claims that I would argue Christianity answers in regards to the ultimate questions we have.
This is where the conversation becomes bigger than evidence alone. Because for many Christians, the claim isn't that there's one perfect argument that proves God beyond all doubt. The idea is that when people ask the deepest questions about meaning, justice, morality, purpose, and why we exist, Christianity offers answers they find compelling and coherent. But here's the part that stood out to me. Arguments can open the door, but for many people, faith becomes personal. The speaker explains that exploring these questions strengthened their belief, but what changed everything wasn't winning a debate. It was reading the Bible and encountering the person of Jesus through the text. Seeing someone who challenged hypocrisy, called people to change, showed compassion, and even in suffering responded with forgiveness. And whether someone agrees or disagrees with that conclusion, that's a different kind of argument, not just about evidence, but experience. So if you're curious, don't stop at clips online. Read for yourself, ask questions, explore. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed videos like this, do well to like this video and hit that subscribe button as we grow this community to 10,000 subscribers and talk more about Christianity. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. God bless.